So I want to show you how to make a couple of doughs, and when you're making a dough, it's really important you use the right tools, obviously a bowl and a dough hook. So we're making pizza dough or we're making bread dough, you're going to use a dough hook and not a paddle. So as we talked about, high protein, mid protein, winter wheats, higher protein over 10.5%. Think, very important, think dough hook, not paddle. We had talked about water temperature. I have everything weighed out, scaled out here, and there's a certain order things go in to make a dough. The first thing, I've temped the water, I've scaled the water. The water goes in first. The next thing, I'm going to put in my sugar and salt. And then I'm going to add my flour. So we have all those ingredients in, and remember when we talked about yeast, and I'm using instant yeast here, I'm just going to put my yeast right on top of the flour. So we have everything in the mixer, the yeast on top. Now I'm just going to turn it on, and I'm going to let it mix for about 30 seconds. We just want to get the water incorporated because, as I told you earlier, oil and water don't mix. So before I add the oil, I want to get it to a consistency of like a pie dough. And it's about there right now. You see how the water's been absorbed. You have the water into the flour. Now when I add the oil, the gluten network is not going to be compromised, because what happens if you add the oil too early, or you add the oil with the water, it coats the gluten strands. And when you coat the gluten strands, you don't get as much strength, or the protein strands that make gluten, you don't get as much strength out of the dough. And now you just turn it on and let it mix out. You could see now it's coming together. And remember how we talked about water being a solvent. You see how it's pulling the dough away and scraping against the mixer to take all the dough off that mixing bowl. So this is the first part of it. We're going to have in about 2 or 3 minutes when we come back, we'll have sort of a dough ball, and I'll pull out a piece of dough and show you what it looks like as the gluten's developing. So we'll see you in a couple minutes. So I'm going to stop the mixer. We're at about 4 or 5 minutes. The dough's not totally developed. I'm going to pull a piece off, and I just want to show you the dough isn't quite developed. So if I pull it, it's going to rip. When this dough is fully developed in another 3 minutes, I'm going to be able to stretch this as thin, and you could see what's called a window pane. You could feel right now the dough is a little clumpy. It hasn't completely developed yet. So we're going to turn this on for, like I said, another 3 minutes, and then we'll come back and show you the finished dough. So the dough is about done. And one key thing about mixing dough, you always would rather undermix it than overmix it. If you undermix it, it's going to develop when it's in the refrigerator overnight or for 24 or 48 hours. So I stopped this dough just before it was completely developed, but you could see the way it stretches here. It's mixed about 8 minutes, and as I stretch it, it's not tearing. Before, remember how it tore, and look how thin I could get that middle here as I keep pulling on it. And that's your gluten network developing. So as I pull this apart, I've taken a little piece of dough and stretched it, and then in 24 to 48 hours, it's going to even be more pliable. So you could see, I don't know if we could get a really close shot of this, but see how thin, it's almost a layer. You could see my finger right underneath it. And that's called window painting. If you were looking at this really, really close, you could actually see the protein strands that developed into gluten from the mixing. So when you're able to do this with a dough, you know it's done. You pull it out, let it rest on the table for about 5 minutes, cut it up, and then get it into the refrigerator for your retarding process for the next 24 to 48 hours. So I get a lot of questions in my travels around the country talking about dough and how to roll a dough ball. So we've cut these dough balls up, or the dough up, and what you do is you take the dough, You just sort of make it a little round in your hand. Then you use the table for friction. And I'm just using this part of my hand, the bottom part of my hand, the bottom 3 fingers. And I'm rolling the dough against those fingers. I'm putting very little pressure. There's no pressure on this part of my hand. It's all on the lower hand, and I just push it against each other. I'll show you again here. Again, the fingers, these thumbs aren't doing anything except guiding. I'm using the friction from the table and the pressure from this part of my hand. 3 fingers down, just rolling it back and forth. And that's your dough ball. The next dough I'm going to mix is called the Primordine Farina. It's going to be a Neapolitan style dough. And what I want to show you with this dough is there's 4 ingredients. You have water, flour. Look how little yeast is in this. Very little yeast, and the same with salt. Very little salt. Same process. We're going to put the water in. And remember, I told you this is a very hydrated dough. So we're running about 62% water in this. I put the water in, that very little bit of salt. I'm going to add the flour. And then I'm going to put the yeast on the top. And earlier I talked about bowl friction, and you could see the little bit of yeast. Bowl friction is, when I talked about 30 degrees, it's as the hook is moving in the dough, it creates friction. As that dough is mixing, it creates friction in the bowl. That friction is heat. And usually with a mixer like this or a planetary mixer, it's about 30 degrees. And that's what I was talking about earlier with the 30-degree dough friction factor. When you get into spiral mixers, it's a little higher. So we'll talk about it a little bit as it mixes. We'll show you what we mean, but I wanted to make sure we touched on that. So when we put this on the mixer and we get a close-up shot on it, you're going to have a hard time seeing the yeast because there's hardly any in here. And that's the key when you're making a Neapolitan-style flour. Very little salt, very little sugar. The fermentation is what gives it the flavor. So you turn on the mixer, and here we're not adding oil, so we're just going to mix this out. And when I was talking about that friction factor, you could see how the dough hook is mixing. That is creating heat in the dough. That's the 30 degrees of the friction factor we talked about in lesson 2 with the scaling of the water and the temperature of the water. And both the all trumps that I mixed and this D-Prime, both were scaled and both were temps, so we would get an 80-degree dough. Okay. So the dough is mixed. Winter wheat. Now remember, when I talked about winter wheat, not as much stretch. This dough is pretty good because we put a lot of water in there. We're probably at the 64% on the water. Little bit softer. If you saw me with the all trumps, it was a little bit more tenacious when I pulled on it. You could see how quickly a winter wheat is going to stretch and go to that window painting. Now, here I have a much bigger piece of dough, and I stretched it about the size of the all trumps. And you could see if I stretch it too much, you'll get a little tearing because it is a winter wheat, not as much protein. But again, there's your window painting. You could see the dough is developed. We don't want it to get totally developed. We want to take it out of the mixer maybe a minute earlier in order to get that dough perfect when it comes out of the refrigerator after it's retarded for 24 to 48 hours. So that's a winter wheat dough, a little bit different than the all trumps dough or the high protein dough, a little bit softer. I don't know if you could tell by the way I'm handling it. It is a little bit softer than the all trumps dough. And remember, hardly any yeast and hardly any salt in this dough. We're going to be fermenting this a minimum of 48 hours and probably 72. So the last thing I want to show you how to mix is a soft wheat. And I'm going to use the Pillsbury Baker's Plus yellow cake mix to give you the example. Remember, soft wheat creates a batter, not a dough. And when I'm using soft wheat, I'm using a paddle. I'm not using a hook. I'm going to be using a paddle. What you got to remember, especially with mixes, is there's a reason we put directions on the boxes. We have to follow the directions. So, mixing directions. It says 3 cups of cool water or a pound 8 ounces. This is a pound 8 ounces, not 3 cups. I measured that out. Vegetable oil, 2/3 a cup. It says 4.5 ounces. I measured 4.5 ounces. Remember, when we're talking about measuring, we're always using a scale. So pounds and ounces, and the mix, it says 6 2/3 cup, 2 pounds, 4 ounces. We're using 2 pounds, 4 ounces. The directions: pour half of the water into the bowl. And this is what you would call a 2 or 3 stage method. Then you're going to add the cake mix and mix it. This is just to incorporate the ingredients. And you're going to mix it for, according to this, about a minute. Then we're going to scrape it down. So let me get the mixer set up here. Okay, always make sure you lock your mixer in. Put in your paddle. And when you put in the paddle, there's a little notch. There's 2 notches. The notches that goes in, and then you move it over, and that's the notch that locks it in. And then you put on your safety so you don't get your hands in there. Very important. So I have the water and the mix in there, and I'm just going to turn it on and mix it for a minute. This is on very low speed. We're just going in there to incorporate the water and the mix, just to get it incorporated enough where I could use my trusty scraper and scrape it down. So after I scrape it down, the next steps, I'm going to add, I'm going to mix the batter 1 minute in slow speed, stop it. So I got that minute in. That's just to incorporate it. Now I'm going to go 3 minutes in medium speed. At the end of the 3 minutes, we'll be back and we'll scrape it down and show you how to put in the rest of the ingredients. So now it's mixed 3 minutes. I'm going to stop it. I'm going to lower the bowl, take off the safety, and I'm just going to scrape down. Now you want to scrape it down good, but as long as you get in there and get it off the sides, you're fine. You just don't want any residue on the bottom that doesn't mix. And this is a pretty small mixer, so that shouldn't happen with something like this. So I scraped it down. I'm going to put this over here. Now, safety back on. Bring it back up. And it's really important, a mixer like this is a safety issue. They don't want your hands in there. You're going to put it on very slowly, and then you're going to add the rest of the water and oil. And personally, I like to add the water, then the oil, or you could even add them together. That's fine too, but I like to add it one at a time. And after the entire amount of water is in and oil's in, we're going to let it mix through for another minute, stop it, scrape it one more time, and then mix it at a little faster speed for 2 minutes. So we have both in there. We're going to go about a minute, because what happens if you leave it like this and you don't scrape it down and you turn it on fast, you're going to be wearing a bunch of cake mix. It's going to splatter all over the place. So you want to make sure you get that first little mix in there to incorporate. We'll scrape it down and then we'll mix it out for 2 minutes. When it's done, you could see it's a very good visual when you're thinking about soft wheat flour. So that's about a minute there. Again, we're going to lower it, this off. Just a quick scrape. And it's very soupy when it's like this, because obviously the cake mix didn't want to accept that much water and oil that quickly. So we scrape it down, we get it off the paddle. And same thing, put the safety on. Bring it back up. Now slowly start a little slow now that we mixed it. Now you could increase the speed because that way we've incorporated a lot of the mix with the water and oil. Now you could bring it to that medium speed and it'll all blend together. You do that about 2 minutes. And at the end of the 2 minutes, we'll show you the visual of the final product. And the reason I wanted to do this and show you the visual, remember what dough looked like. Remember how it was rolling the dough balls? Well, obviously you can't do this with a batter. And this should be done in about 60 seconds. But you could see I'm at a steady medium speed. If you go too fast, if you mix the dough, if you mix this batter at on third speed, you're going to incorporate too much air into the batter. When you incorporate too much air, it opens up. You get what's called this tunneling. You get these holes in your cake. You want to go at a nice steady speed. And we're about done now. It's all incorporated. You could see it. And this is the visual I wanted to show you. So I'm going to take this off, unlock it. When you think of cake or you think of soft wheat, think batter. Don't think dough. If it's soft wheat, you're going to get a batter if you're adding a lot of liquid. So that's the visual we wanted to show you. Thanks for your time. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at tom.santos@genmills.com.